Hello viewer, I'd like to talk about this channel I used to associate myself with. His name is the Liberal Sanity Project, and I drifted away from this channel recently. He talked about many great things. For example, he tries to debunk theories and concepts made by the far right or the fascists of this website. And what drew me away was that he made an ideological assumption. And this assumption is bad because it's focusing on a ideology that has major contradictions with the other. And this mistake between one ideology and another leads to dangerous assumptions that blur the line between these two beliefs. These beliefs I'm talking about is communism and fascism. And he just throws it away. He throws all historical importance. He focuses on a few selected events. And he goes with this with his grand narrative.
The opposite of fascism is not communism, it's democracy and the ability to disagree. To take away that is fascism by any name or color. Disagreeing with what one has to say but defending to death their right to say it is the foundation of democracy. The act of recognizing their right to disagree and being willing to defend that right is the process by which the social contract is granted legitimacy.
I agree that fascism and democracy are antithetical to each other, and I value democracy as one of the greatest systems that humanity has ever made. I believe that people should live under a constitution, under a social construct that benefits the population and the masses. Elections and opposition as well as pluralism should be things that a society must embrace. And I believe that these things are important. However, I feel like liberal democracies bring this to an exaggerated version of itself. One that destroys itself, that ruins the society that is supposed to create freedom. The problem with liberalism is that it removes itself. In many cases, for example Hitler's rise to power, the people elected the NSDAP or the National Socialist Workers' Party or the Nazi Party to power through elections. And even though Hitler himself wasn't elected, he allowed his own party to get involved in government, and that was praised by millions. If that isn't proof of how weak democracies can be, then I don't know what is. So from my point of view, liberalism is the very thing that ruins democracy. Democracies can preserve themselves if they use force to destroy those that seek to destroy them. If the US government respected the Confederates in the American Civil War, then America simply wouldn't exist as a unified nation.
Liberal values are more beautiful because they include the freedom to disregard those principles and embrace fascism if one so chooses. If conformity has to be achieved at the end of a gun, then the ideas one conforms to lack any meaningful legitimacy. If communism could be achieved democratically, it would be achieved democratically. That they can't win by ballot is why communists fancy themselves as revolutionaries.
I find it funny that you're anti-fascist, but you want fascists to have the ability to spread their beliefs. Honestly, when you just look at history, for example, Austria, you see that there is the destruction of democracies through fascism. Fascism gained power through elections. And you're just fine with it. The thing about this guy, he doesn't really go into that much research. Like, There's this thing called Euro-communism. Like, the Euro-communists weren't extremists. They tried to appeal to the masses in a non-violent way, though they didn't reject violence, but they were trying to appeal to people in a more moderate way. And the Euro-communists also didn't like the Soviet Union's invasion of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And these people weren't the type of individuals to support purges or those things. And your whole concept of this ideology falls apart with things like this. Like, parties under like Euro-communism, like the Italian Communist Party, disagreed with the Soviet Union on many issues. Even though they were funded by the Soviets, they spoke against them in certain issues like the Soviet-Afghan War, or those two invasions of those Eastern Bloc countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The PCI was against that. And the PCI also appealed to the religious. They appealed to many groups within the country. That goes against your own perception of this ideology. Like, the PCI had a relationship with a conservative party, like I believe the Christian Democrats of Italy. Like, they form an alliance with those people, and that's different from the radicals you usually think about. Like, the Euro-communists weren't really that bad in how they handle these issues. Though this alone is one example of how your beliefs are biased to one conception of reality. Another example of how your narrative falls apart upon itself is what happened to Chile in the 1970s. Like, Salvador Allende was elected as president of the country, and he was a Marxist. And the military of his country overthrew him and forced him to die. And it caused disorder in the country. And this is an example of how your biases cloud events. Like, you focus on these certain viewpoints around history, and you ignore vital parts of it, and you blind it even further with your liberal nonsense. And Pinochet, the person that replaced Allende, destroyed democracy. He tortured people and he caused poverty. And another thing with Pinochet was that he caused breadlines, he caused people to starve, he killed many people. And I haven't seen you make a video about Pinochet yet.
In the 50s and 60s, Chile's progressive developmental policies were a beacon in the region. The government invested in health, education and industry. American corporations were worried their investments would suffer. In response, the US State Department began sponsoring students from Chile and the rest of South America to study free market economics with Milton Friedman.
The University of Chicago had a joint arrangement with the Catholic University of Chile, under which a great many Chilean students came to the University of Chicago, were trained by us and received PhDs.
These students went back and taught in Chile. The Catholic University Economics Department in Santiago became a little Chicago school. Arnold Harberger, the economist in charge of the program, described himself as a seriously dedicated missionary. In 1970, Salvador Allende's Popular Unity government won the election on a platform of nationalization of large sectors of the economy. Chile's phone company was majority owned by the US corporation ITT. It spearheaded attempts to stop Allende becoming president. It had the support of Richard Nixon in the White House.
I was not there, but I can tell you what we now know to be a fact. He ordered the CIA to prevent Allende from assuming the presidency. And indeed, they tried to get me to lean on the Chilean military right after Allende was elected.
Despite the efforts of the CIA, Allende was sworn in as president. Richard Nixon ordered the CIA director to make the economy scream.
Señor Nixon es presidente de Estados Unidos y yo soy presidente de Chile. Yo no tendré un término despectivo contra el señor Nixon mientras el señor Nixon respete al presidente de Chile.
Preparations began for the military coup. The Chilean Chicago boys started work on a 500-page economic blueprint called the BRIC. With US funding, everything was done to destabilize the economy. Truck drivers went on strike, bringing factories and shops to a standstill. There was a failed coup attempt on June the 29th, 1973. And then on September the 11th, with General Pinochet leading the army, the assault began on the presidential palace. Chile had enjoyed 41 years of uninterrupted, peaceful democratic rule. Now it was being violently overthrown. Pinochet and his supporters described the coup as a war. It was certainly designed to look like one. It was a Chilean precursor to shock and awe.
Bad ideas have consequences, and those consequences are measured in human lives. The reason I open declaring the value in disagreement is because we live in a world where people today would strip that freedom away from you if they had such an opportunity to do so. It is not just fascists who wish to do this. This sort of a world has existed before, and the Soviet Union was no stranger to using violence to force conformity. Polish prisoners of war, for example, fell into the custody of the Soviet NKVD, some 26,000 prisoners in fact, and why squander a good labor force? Several thousand were rumored to have been sent off to die in forced labor camps in order to mine for gold in Kolyma, a gulag in eastern Siberia. The remaining Polish prisoners of war were subjected to numerous interviews by NKVD officers under the pretenses of releasing them. The interviews actually functioned as a means of determining which Poles would be executed and which would be spared. The basis for this selection was political belief. The determining basis for life and death was whether or not any one prisoner could politically conform to the communist regime's desires. By April of 1940, a final decision was reached, and 21,857 Polish prisoners, military officers, police officers, and other Polish intelligentsia were executed by NKVD officers at Katyn Forest, Kharkiv, Kalinin Oblast, and other places of detention. After the fall of Nazi Germany, custody of many of the former concentration camps fell into the Soviets' hands, and rather than close the camps for the crime they were, the camps were utilized instead. The communist NKVD made it a mission to utilize the former concentration camp of Buchenwald for the internment of prisoners. The first prisoners were supposed to be exclusively Nazis, but later, anybody seen as a threat to the occupying Soviet regime could be imprisoned. The conditions inside the camp were crowded, cold, and plagued with pests.
I do not deny anything that happened in that country, and my own beliefs are distinct from it. It's completely different in many issues, and I deviate from the norms of those that embrace it. So, this wouldn't count for me. I don't deny history or anything relating to this issue at all.
Every experiment with communism failed, and the human toll of these experiments will scar for generations. When liberals get the bullet too becomes a catchphrase you use to express your disappointment in liberalism, you've progressed from being any kind of meaningful defender of democracy to a terrorist who simply wishes to kill people who disagree with you.
I wish that people wouldn't fight. I wish that there would be peaceful discourse and peaceful solutions to many world problems. Violence as a tool for political power is distasteful to me, though there are cases in which it must happen. For example, in fascist countries like Franco's Spain, you have rebel groups that fought against his rule. In my opinion, that was justified because people were fighting for their will to vote and their will to democracy. In fact, those protests in Spain, as well as in Portugal, were supported by the Euro-communists. You have many cases of such political parties conforming to Western democracies. Once again, you made the mistake of assuming all countries that were guided under this ideology or under parties influenced by Marxism were violent. Even when you look at places like Bolivia, under the control of Evo Morales or the Sandinistas, and when you look at other countries like the FLN, I believe, in Algeria, and I think another party in Ethiopia that's similar to that, they go against your narrative once again, because not only have some of them toppled more oppressive regimes, many of them also established elections, opposition parties, protests, and pluralism. All these things you talk about, all these aspects of Western society existed and can exist without liberalism.
On October the 21st, 1969, there took place a bloodless socialist revolution in Somalia, one of whose first aims was to forge a healthy economy based upon the united talents of her people. In traditional handicrafts, for example, crafts of wood carving, of stone cutting, ivory, metal, and leatherwork, there previously existed only the single craftsman, catering in a haphazard way for the needs of his tiny local clientele. The revolution changed that, setting up fully equipped cooperatives, in which the craftsman's skills could be enhanced through contact with his fellows, in which he could create more and better goods for an expanding market, including a hard currency market overseas. Since the Socialist Revolution, cotton, for centuries a staple product of the nearby Sudan and of Egypt, has been grown in Somalia on experimental farms set up by the government. In the Shabelle region, the Somaltex textile factory at Balad was built and equipped with the most modern equipment. The intention at the outset was to make the country self-sufficient in bleached and dyed cotton fabrics, an objective now achieved with an annual production of 10 million yards. In the government's plan, hard currency resources previously spent on costly textile imports can now be diverted to other vital development projects.
But that wasn't real communism, some will predictably argue. There are better examples to look at than Stalin's Russia or Mao's China, it is argued, as if I'm simply supposed to ignore the fact that every time communism is attempted, it is done so by people who share or believe communist ideals and draw their ideals from the same source material as other communists.
And if we were to go by this view, then all the revolutions like the American Revolution are unjustified because they were made through violence. And it was made by people who shared the opinions of early liberals like John Locke.
Spanish Catalonia summarily executed or assassinated at least 8,000 clergy and capitalists, and Rojava is a literal war zone. There are no good examples of communism. Whether by state regimes or small communes, they are often built on the bodies of others and justified on the idea that we simply cannot disagree. When re-education gulags are proposed for capitalists, fascists, and reactionaries, political prisons which deprive people of their freedoms until they come to agree with the communist societal structure, it becomes a fascism of a different color. Humanitarian gulags are about as oxymoronic as peaceful ethnic cleansing. There is no such thing as a humanitarian political prison, and to float the idea of such a thing reeks of fascism by a different name, and that is precisely the point I wish to make with this video. At the end of the day, red fascism is still fascism.
The only good thing that I have to say about this last segment is that you said that anarchists have done horrible things, which is true. And the only thing you have shown is bias. If we were to go deeper and be true to ourselves, then we know that all societies have caused death and destruction, and all societies have caused harm. So stop being so biased